Okay, for our next discussion, we're going to talk about early Reconstruction in Arkansas. Remember, with the Civil War, the Union government never recognized secession as a legal fact. Saw the areas in the South in rebellion, and they were working to try to restore the Constitution and restore federal law and federal control over the Confederacy. Now, slowly, as the war continued, Union forces were able to take over more and more territory. So by 1863, Abraham Lincoln was trying to come up with means of bringing the war to a speedier conclusion. A way of trying to bring kind of lukewarm Confederates, those kind of souring on the idea of Confederacy, Unionists in the South, to come back over to the Union side. So what President Abraham Lincoln is trying to do is try to shorten the war. And part of that meant the establishing loyal Union governments, state, county, especially the state levels across the Confederacy. So in 1863, the first Reconstruction plan is established, a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. Now, this allowed a new Union government to be established in the southern state if 10% of the qualified voters repudiated secession. And pledged loyalty to the Union. As we give up secession, come back to pledge loyalty to the Union side. Now, what's going to end up doing is this is actually going to allow a Union government to begin operating in Arkansas of 1864. Also, there was one in Tennessee. Now, the U.S. Army takes control of Little Rock in September of 1863. By that point, for the rest of the war, you're essentially going to have a very difficult situation in Arkansas. Essentially, northern and eastern Arkansas are going to be controlled by Union forces, the Union government, while southwestern Arkansas is going to remain Confederate, controlled out of the area of Washington and Washington, Arkansas, and not far from Hope, around here. Tiny little town still there today. It's home of the Southwest Arkansas Regional Archives Fort Historical Research Center. A lot of the old buildings from that era, very nicely maintained. Essentially, you've got two governments operating in Arkansas, both claiming to be the legitimate government of Arkansas, which ended up meaning that Arkansas was in complete chaos. Battle still going back and forth, refugees running from one side to the other, trying to escape armies. Shortages, especially on the Confederate side. But this 10% plan was able to establish a new Union government in Arkansas. Now, this plan didn't, for many Unionists and radicals in the North, it didn't satisfy them enough. It seemed like it was too easy a way out. That the whole cause of the war, the difference between North and South slavery, was untouched. It's basically just you had many Northerners who had suffered so many horrible casualties that they had during the war. They want the South punished. They want to hurt them. They want to get back at them. They want to break down the South, make sure this never happens again. I felt this plan was way too lenient. But Lincoln wants them. He wants forgiveness. He wants, as he said repeatedly, to bind together the nation's wounds. So by March 4th, 1864, the Constitution of 1864 is ratified. And a unionist government is in place in Little Rock, such as it is. But remember, a lot of representatives from Confederate-held areas can't even attend, don't even exist. They aren't responding to this new government. So the new unionist government is not really able to exert control of the entire state. The state is very hollow because some of its wealthiest agricultural areas are still under Confederate control. Remember, Arkansas is still very much an agricultural state. Isaac Murphy is elected governor of this new unionist government. Remember, Murphy, at the secession convention in 1861, he was the lone holdout in northern Arkansas, and he voted against secession. Everyone's pressuring him to. He stayed loyal to the Union because he stood on his principles. The Unionists now at the end of the war are naming him governor. Persistence pays off. Integrity pays off. Now, among the other items in this new Constitution were the office of Lieutenant Governor was established for the first time. But it's only going to exist for 10 years. By the time the post-Reconstruction government's coming to power, the old conservative planters coming back to power, they're going to abolish this office. And one of the most important elements of this new Constitution is slavery was abolished. So slavery is now gone in Arkansas, at least in Union-held areas. Actually, you're going to end up having several former slaves and several free African Americans are going to participate in these Reconstruction-era governments. Let's say the lieutenant governor was a man named Calvin Bliss. He's an abolitionist. He was actually born in Vermont. He had come to Arkansas in 1854 to Helena, where he tried to establish a school with his wife. Then at moving to Batesville, where he farmed and worked for real estate. When the Civil War came, Bliss, like a lot of other Unionists in northern Arkansas, went to Missouri to join an Arkansas Unionist regiment. But Bliss, though, ardent abolitionist, though, he didn't have a whole lot of influence on the conduct of the government. Like I say, his job was mostly ceremonial. Basically, the lieutenant governor, all he basically did was preside over the Senate and wait to succeed the governor if anything should happen to him. But in the Reconstruction era, though, Bliss was trying to work with Union officials, African Americans, African American churches, and African community to try to help lift up the African American community, lift them up from slavery, try to get them, try to make the community self-sufficient and prosperous. But Bliss was an unrepentant voice for unionism. Believed in the Union, believed in abolition, and was outspoken figure for this even after his term in office as lieutenant governor ended. He formed a unionist newspaper, pro-Reconstruction newspaper, after the Civil War. But while he was out of the state, business in Washington in 1866. His newspaper office burned to the ground. Afterwards, he returned to life as a farmer, dying in Pulaski County in 1891. Now, Murphy, his primary effort here is to try to stabilize the situation, continue to bring these lukewarm Confederates in southwestern Arkansas, bring them back into the fold, get a functioning government for the entire state, not just for part of it. Now, there is no Republican Party at this point. What you have are Union Democrats and essentially just against the regular faction of other factions of more pro-Confederate Democrats, but they're Unionists. By 1866, though, former Whigs in the state and the Union Democrats tried to organize a new party. Both conservative planter Democrats and Whigs tried to form a party to oust the Unionist government. To that point, something called the Union Party. This party, its opposition party is called the Conservative Party. Now, across the South during Reconstruction, you have these bizarre combinations. Usually, sometimes of former Whigs, these planter Democrats were conservatives. They call themselves different things: conservative Democrats, and so forth. Unionists calling themselves different things: Union Democrats, Union Party. Sometimes they end up becoming a Republican Party or just cease to exist altogether. But after the war, 1866, where you got all these Confederate soldiers coming home, conservative planters coming back, they're wanting to turn the clock back to 1860. Put back everything the way it was. Basically ignore the war and just go to war like nothing had ever happened. Basically putting themselves back in charge. So in the 1866 elections, the conservatives swept away the Unionists and turned to power many of these same people. Now Murphy, he and Bliss been elected to 4-year terms. It's another feature of this 1864 Constitution. So he's going to be in office till 1868. The old planters are going to try to restore their economic and political status and to retain control of the land, but with slavery gone, they had to bargain for labor of former slaves. So sharecropping ends up cropping up everywhere. Basically, many of them are staying on many former slaves are staying on these plantations or moving to other ones and renting out their basically paying rent to the landlords, old planters, farm on these lands. Now the rent was paid in crops. That is the term sharecropper. About a lot of sharecroppers this time period, late 1800s. Like I said, not all of them are going to be African American. But in the immediate post-Civil War era, most of sharecroppers are going to be African American. It's the basic problem that existed because of emancipation. While it needed to be done, it was a very necessary thing for the salvation of this nation, its economic system, and our system of free government. What's going to happen to the slaves afterward? They're free men and women. They can make their own choice. They can do whatever they want, but what skills do they have? Remember, it was illegal to educate slaves. Most can't read and write. They have no money of their own, so they can't buy property. They can't afford to go to college. Next thing, no place where they could go and learn new skills. So many of these former slaves, the only thing they were good at was farming. So they stayed as sharecroppers. And shares of these crops would be like a third of their entire cotton crop, sometimes up to half. Sometimes they end up getting so deep in debt so they need to live between harvests that they end up deep in debt to the landlords. So deep in debt that many southern states end up passing laws saying that sharecroppers could not leave the land if they owed money. So essentially, for many of these former freedmen, it became slavery in a new form. Slave not by law, not to the landlord, but slave by their own debts. And the landlords rigging the system to where an indebted man could not leave the land. Now, one thing that had been established was the Freedmen's Bureau. That was in 1865. The formal name of it was the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It was operating in Arkansas in June 1865. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau they had several different things it was supposed to do. Among other things, act as a legal liaison between sharecroppers and landlords, basically develop the labor and the land and rental contracts. They're basically acting as a court in any kind of contractual disputes. Freedmen's Bureau also provided food and medical care to freedmen and loyal refugees, but loyal refugees only. They could not be former Confederates. They could only have been Unionists. Would upset the great bulk of the population, of the white population, which had supported the Confederacy. So the Freedmen's Bureau also provided education for freedmen and loyal refugees, and mostly the freedmen. Established schools even. So you'd have men, women, children of all ages in these schools learning to read and write. And in many states across the South, this was the first attempt at a statewide school system from many southern states, the Freedmen's Bureau. But the real problem was it only increased racial tensions between whites and blacks, because as African Americans receiving the bulk of these benefits and former Confederates and many whites, they're locked out of these services. So making it for everyone, it was just only for a few. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau had a lot of problems in a lot of states. Mismanagement, incompetence. A lot of men and Freedmen's Bureau officers or officials really didn't want to do their jobs. But it had a few successes here and there in Arkansas. Some men who were better at it than others. There were several organizations trying to establish schools and colleges in Arkansas for the freedmen population. Methodist Church among them, Quaker Church among them. In Helena, they established Southland College, a brief attempt to try to bring education to the freedmen. Only lasted a few years, but essentially it wasn't just a college like you see with modern colleges, but it was also primary education, basic education, learning to read, write, basic arithmetic, on up to skilled trades. But there's a very serious problem, though, for Arkansas and other states across the South, which was, for so many years, these farms and plantations have been neglected. Fields were overrun. A lot of them have been wrecked by armies marching back and forth across them. So crop yields are down. So Arkansas is entering a severe economic depression after the end of the war. The situation is especially critical for Arkansas because Arkansas, like the rest of the South, they put all their money into slaves and Confederate bonds. Confederate bonds, which were worthless at the end of the war, slaves were freed. Remember, in a slave-based system, people were counted as property, as money. But now that's over, you can't do that anymore. So Arkansas basically had to start over with nothing. No money. The lands which had been so rich before the war have been neglected, and they're having basically to start over from scratch. They get on up into 1867, some very lean years from Arkansas. Well, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated in 1865, and Andrew Johnson, his successor, had started a fairly program similar to Lincoln, somewhat lenient, trying to bring Confederacy in, called Restoration, from 1865 to 67. Under Restoration, former Confederate officials could have their property and voting rights restored by a presidential pardon. Southern states had not been readmitted already. He readmitted only if they repudiated Confederate debt, which is a huge issue because the Union government considers it to be Confederacy to be an illegal operation. They didn't want anybody making money off of it. They repudiated secession and ratified the 13th Amendment. Arkansas, which had already abolished slavery, they ratified the 13th Amendment without any problem. And the problem was there's a lot of so many of these former Confederate officials and some of these cheerleaders of the Confederacy in the South, especially in states like Arkansas, they had returned to power. So you got the radical Republicans come in 1867. Establishing something called radical Reconstruction. See, Republicans have won a 2/3 veto-proof majority in Congress in the 1866 midterm elections. Johnson, who had been a Democrat, a Unionist Democrat for Tennessee, seemed to be so hostile to issues such as civil rights for freedmen and restoring order in the South that essentially led to Johnson's impeachment of 1868. Johnson survived impeachment, but the radicals had such a tight control over Congress, and with 2/3 veto-proof majority, Johnson could veto all he wanted as president, but Congress would simply override with a 2/3 majority vote for both houses. So 1867 to about 1876, you had a period of radical Reconstruction. And so what the radical Republicans are wanting to do is they're wanting to tear down the Confederacy, tear down the Old South, all the vestiges of it, all the old planter class, get rid of all these guys who started the Civil War, basically wipe it clean, politically speaking. Essentially tear down the Old South and rebuild it in the Northern Republican image, based on free soil, free labor, and free men. And it would be the freedmen who would back up and support these new radical Republican governments. See, at this time, African Americans voted overwhelmingly Republican because the Republican Party at that time was seen as the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party of emancipation, the party of civil rights. And African Americans would tend to stay very loyal to the Republican Party in about the 1920s until the National Republicans, more conservative Republicans, stepped away from civil rights, started actively becoming increasingly hostile to it. So much so that by the 1960s, most of the National Democrats who were embracing civil rights, the two parties essentially switched positions. African Americans started voting overwhelmingly for the Democrats. Now, to this point, It's African Americans are tending to vote overwhelmingly Republican. Among these issues here with radical Reconstruction included the Military Reconstruction Acts. It passed in 1967. So this is a series of 3 separate acts which divide southern states into 5 military districts. Tennessee was accepted because they ratified the 14th Amendment, will become the 14th Amendment. Freedom would be registered to vote by the military. Is to make sure they were properly registered and wouldn't be any kind of shenanigans to try to disfranchise and take their vote away. And all former Confederates are now banned from voting. Qualified voters who never supported the Confederacy would draw up a new state constitution guaranteed African American suffrage and would ratify the 14th Amendment. Essentially, all of these planners coming up again, that was too much for the radicals. So basically, they're kicking them all out of Congress. Officials across the South are removed for impeding Reconstruction. Again, one of the Military Reconstruction Acts, basically, civilian governments thrust out of office and martial law imposed. Now, 14th Amendment is considered important because essentially it codified the radical Republican plan for Reconstruction. Among other things, declared all persons born or naturalized in the United States to be citizens. Bill of Rights privileges there. Therefore, if you're born on American soil, you're an American citizen, period. End of discussion. Slaves were therefore American citizens, and they had all the rights of any other American citizen, regardless of color. Now today, that portion of it, the idea of citizenship and equality of the law, that's the most important element of the 14th Amendment. And radicals feared that some future government might try to strip away these rights, but if it was enshrined in the Constitution, these rights wouldn't be protected. But at that time, though, it stripped all former Confederate officials and troops of their voting rights unless Congress pardoned them, not the President, not President Johnson. Congress pardoned them. And repudiated the Confederate debt. So supporting this is going to be a precondition of readmission. Basically, these states are essentially broken back to territories until they could form new governments acceptable to the radical administration. Next, say Arkansas, Mississippi, placed under martial law as part of the 4th Military District. So Texas and Louisiana placed under a separate one. And many former Confederates are disqualified from holding office or participating in the process. So that brings us to the next step. Constitution of 1868. Now, in January 1868, 70 delegates assembled at Little Rock to draft a new state constitution. Remember, it has been 4 years since the old one, the old Unionist Constitution, had been established. But this is the radical Constitution. And meeting at the Capitol, Capitol building itself in Little Rock. This Constitution, as well, is only going to last about 6 years. Now, about 48 of these delegates have been classified as radicals, that is, sympathetic to radical Reconstruction. 17 is conservative, that is opposed to radical Reconstruction. 5 kind of in between. Now, the radicals proposed about 23 Southern white delegates, called scalawags by the conservatives, Scalawag is it's slang for the term. Basically, it's a Southerner who supports Reconstruction. Carpetbagger means something different. Basically, it means somebody who came from the north to the south. Yeah, 17 of these deluxe from outside the South. Now, carpetbagger is kind of a myth in Reconstruction history. Like I said, the most carpetbaggers you'll see basically in areas like Virginia and portions of southern Louisiana. Basically, they were coming down to the South after the war to start business, looking for business opportunities. But carpetbaggers, as those from outside the North, never predominated most of these southern governments. It has a reputation of being kind of these cheap con men running across the South, carrying these cheap suitcases made out of carpets. Hence the term carpetbag. But what ended up happening, though, is as more of these supporters of Reconstruction came from other areas of the South and from the North, the bulk of the former Confederate population basically tried to squeeze them out. So they weren't going to shop at their shops, support their businesses. So more and more of them, as Reconstruction went on across the South, started moving into government positions to try to make a living. It's only adding to the corruption that was taking place in so many of these governments. What you have is, for the first time in these cases, you have Republicans in office across the South for the first time, and they are stealing the place blind, taxing bankrupt populations to the hilt, try to build railroads, and even changing the laws to try to extend their terms in office, even trying to boost their pay at taxpayer expense. So the corruption, if already was going to be the most corrupt era in American political history, North and South, is made worse because Republicans in office across the South for the first time ever now bring in some of the most corrupt governments those states have ever seen, adding to the sting of defeat and poverty they're facing in the post-war situation. Now, there are 8 African-American delegates, one of them including John Bray Lucas, a freedman, state legislator, outspoken civil rights activist. Actually, Lucas would actually end up being a deputy U.S. attorney in Illinois later in his career under President Franklin Roosevelt. But of all the statewide officials in Arkansas during Reconstruction, all of them were from the South, from somewhere in the South. The only exception being possibly Calvin Bliss, but he came to Arkansas before the war even started. So he was an Arkansas resident already. But the deliberations over the 1868 Constitution were divisive. They continued the idea of a governor and a lieutenant governor staying intact. Brought in many new changes to Arkansas. Gives African American men the right to vote. Recognize the equality of all persons before the law, regardless of color. In legal equality, an important element here. It's not necessarily going to be recognized in many areas and jurisdictions. Is at least on paper. That's an important start. And slavery being banned was a fact. It was African Americans could also serve in the militia and on the jury These are considered to be very important because juries meant that people accused of different crimes, they could have a jury truly representative of their peers. So convictions would not necessarily be on, or acquittals not necessarily based on, strictly on racial terms, that everyone had a voice in the process. State militia, which is basically the State National Guard, basically allowing African Americans to take up arms in defense of the law, the Constitution, and the state. It also established a system of public education. Statewide public school system established for the first time. Now, there have been schools, primary schools in Arkansas before, but a lot of them were private, local academies. Some communities established their own local schools, but again, it's only at the local level. Racial discrimination was illegal under this new Constitution. The thing is about the public education system, though, was segregated schools. Blacks and whites would have to be in separate schools. And also established a state university. Under the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862, the federal government is giving out, allowing states to take a portion of federal lands the federal government gives to them and use the finances from that, from rentals, mineral rights, whatever else, land sales, to use that financing to create a state university in those states. Now, the Moral Land Grant Act would end up creating 63 state university systems across the country. And because of that, one of those universities established would be the University of Arkansas. It would be established in 1873. So it's about the first few years of the University of Arkansas's existence. Students could go tuition free, wouldn't have to pay anything. They could meet the entrance exams. The Constitution was ratified on March 3rd, 1868. Now, the major issue in this campaign is granting full civil and political rights to African Americans, and there was questions of irregularities in voting on both sides, but the majority of voters approved the new charter. The new state legislature would ratify the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Arkansas is formally readmitted to the Union June 22, 1868, and they now start sending congressmen and senators back to Congress. The new governor of this new document was Powell Clayton. He was 34, former federal cavalry officer from Kansas, served in the battles of Helena and Pine Bluff. He'd been a Democrat before the war, Union Democrat. But as Arkansas politics evolved and the violence against freedmen, supporters of Reconstruction, these Union Democrats being pushed more and more into the Republican Party, Clayton among them. By 1867, Clayton had been part of the group who had actually led the creation of the Republican Party in the state. Clayton viewed Reconstruction as a little more of a continuation of the war, and used very aggressive tactics against former Confederates. He used the governor's vastly expanded powers, particularly appointment to the Republican-dominated state legislature, to build a loyal base of support throughout the state. So essentially, Clayton politically is digging in, building support, and getting ready to wage war on anybody who opposed them. But if anybody saw Arkansas in the late 1860s, it basically was a state of war. People being assassinated left and right for their political views, African Americans being lynched, nothing being done about it. Thomas Hindman, who had been a Confederate general from Helena, he, after the war, returned to Arkansas and said that Arkansas needed to accept the new reality of the post-war situation. He needed to accept that slavery was gone. The two races needed to work side by side to build Arkansas. As a result of that, in 1868, somebody walked up to his front window one night, shot and killed him while he sat inside of his house. So the Ku Klux Klan was rising in the state by 1868. Now, the Ku Klux Klan was an organization of former Confederates, Confederate sympathizers. They were determined basically to try to overthrow these Reconstruction governments and turn the clock back to 1860. Strip away the rights of African Americans, turn them back into slaves. They would do this by whatever means necessary. Like I said, they wore those dumb white sheets because they're as a disguise, they're pretending to be the ghosts of fallen Confederate soldiers. Like I said, the term Ku Klux doesn't actually mean anything. A couple different theories on where the word came from, but by 1868 it was a reality in the state. Like I said, burning people's homes, assaulting people, murder. By any definition, the Klan was a terrorist organization. It's been said that across the South there has not been an African American family that has not been affected in some way by the violence of the Klan. The Klan supposedly was formed in secret by former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. And it spread rapidly across the entire South. But this Klan spread across the entire region, all except the far northwest corner of the state, which never had hardly any slavery or African Americans to begin with. So in 1868, Clayton began to organize the new state militia. State militia he's forming, this will be by troops handpicked by himself. Actually, he had rejected numerous requests for troops for this militia troops from voter registration officials around the state. By the time it's finally organized, the violence is getting so bad by the latter part of 1868 that they can't even conduct voter registrations, which is usually the centralized point in the community. The violence continued. In fact, at one point it was so bad that voter registration was impossible in 12 counties. So Clayton activated the militia to try to suppress this violence and try to return order to the voter registration process and to the legal process. Now, despite all the violence and intimidation, the 1868 election, which is a presidential election year, Clayton managed to ensure the state's electoral votes went to the Republican candidate for president in the federal elections in November. That was Ulysses S. Grant. This was the first time Arkansas voted for a Republican Grant. In fact, it's the first time Arkansas had ever voted for presidential election for a candidate that wasn't a Democrat. That's mostly because, in this case, former Confederates aren't allowed to vote. African Americans are voting in large numbers, and that is for former General Grant. But the election, though, was marred with a lot of inconsistencies and irregularities. This is a routine feature of life in Reconstruction. Ballots destroyed, disruptions at ballot places, voter intimidation. And so after the election, Powell declares martial law and can be called the militia war erupts. The state is divided into 4 military districts, and the militiamen are ordered to assemble at designated points. And so what happens is the men that Clayton had picked to join the militia are mostly African Americans. A few former Union troops that stayed over to live in Arkansas, but mostly African Americans. And so you have that concentrated against the white supremacist Ku Klux Klan. And for the next 5 months, the militia war, you got these running gunfights all over the state between the state militia and the Klansmen. Actually, had a lot of horrible violence across the state. In the stamps, there was a lynching of 7 African Americans and Reconstruction supporters. All 7 killed. It's one of many horrible instances across the state. So it's mostly across the southwest, the southeast, and northeast corners of the state. Again, the Gulf Coast Plains were areas where plantations and African American populations were the highest. Basically, this area all along in here, stamps right about here. There's running gunfights everywhere. Both sides accused of overreaching, but the Ku Klux Klan, remember, that one basically started it. They're burning, they're killing, they're looting. Militia responding with equal force against any type of resistance to state to Clayton's rule. Clayton would agree to lift martial law for county only when he was satisfied that law and order had been restored there. Crittenden County, right up over here, is the last state which martial law was lifted. State control there was finally restored by March 21st, 1869. Those 5 months, those untold number of casualties, took that long to finally destroy the Ku Klux Klan in Arkansas. All the remaining Klan forces were forced from the state, and they have a large proportion of the white population were still sympathetic to the Klan goals and ideals. Klan power was broken, or remained broken until after World War I for the next 50 years. But while Clayton was able to maintain and rebuild order in the state, it was a very high price. It alienated a lot of former Confederates whose support he needed to continue Reconstruction in Arkansas, to continue to maintain these governments. A lot of damage, which disrupted trade and local economies. And it only redoubled the effort of former conservative planters to try to retake control of the state government.